Today I want to take a few minutes and talk about the barriers that are often thrown up when you start talking about developing inclusive programs in schools. Now, I know that oftentimes if you're in the classroom and you have a child that has special needs, most teachers really are not prepared to deal with that student. Why? Because they really lack the training. So automatically, they throw up their hands and say, I'm sorry, we really can't do that. I'm not prepared to do it. And are they right? Absolutely. Now, one of the things that we need to do if we really want to have inclusive schools, we need to start clearly identifying the issues and trying to resolve those. Now, you can take the route that Texas, the state of Texas, did a few years ago. And what they did was they basically said, we're spending an awful lot of money on special education. Money's getting tight. The state legislature and the counties and the local cities were pulling back resources. So they had less funding for their overall programs. So one of the things that they decided to do was come up with an alternative. Now, traditionally, there's about 13% of the public school population requires special education programs for their students. 13% of the student population has some kind of a special needs. Now, what Texas decided to do was put a target, and they said, well, we really want to look at that. We think that maybe we're overdiagnosing people. Maybe we're telling too many children that they have special needs, and they really don't, because they're getting too much in the way of services from our school systems. So they set a benchmark of 8.5. Now, if you have a national average of 13%, and in the state of Texas, prior to the legislature changing that target goal, they had 12.5% of the students required some type of special education. Now, when they decided that because of money, we were going to pull back on the services, they set the target of 8.5%. Now, right now, the United States Department of Education as well as the Justice Department are looking into whether there's a violation of federal laws because of the failure to provide adequate educational services to students with special needs. So, one of the things that we have to do in our schools is be very realistic. Now, one of the things that was interesting, if you look at the material on the way Texas decided at that 8.5 level, there was no real research that went into it. They basically picked a number and said, well, this is what we could afford. So let's shoot for this. So as a result, thousands of students were denied services simply because they were told, I'm sorry, there's no room at the inn. We don't want our quota to go above 8.5. Even though there's a need, we don't want that to happen. So we've got to be very careful about what roadblocks we, as administrators, as those in charge of educational programs, throw up to providing the appropriate education for our students. Now, it's interesting because UNESCO came out about a year ago with their list of barriers to schools developing inclusive programs. And they looked at it and said, number one is attitude. People's attitudes, both inside the school and outside the school in the community, that was the number one barrier to providing inclusive educational programs. The second that they came up with was a physical barrier. Then they talked about curriculum. They said the curriculums aren't prepared to accommodate these students. They talked about teachers as the next level of barriers. They said teachers, they throw up their own barriers to making this a reality. They also talked about language and communication, how it is communicated to families, to the general community, and to the teachers about what an inclusive program actually means. They also talked about social and economic issues as throwing up barriers. Because oftentimes people say, I don't want those children in my school. I don't want them with my children because my children are really above average. And as a result, because they're pretty much the children of Lake Wobegon, everyone's brilliant. Therefore, especially my child, so please don't slow down my child's education. They also talked about funding, the lack of funding. Texas is a prime example of that, but they're not the only state. And also organizational structure. Organizations, meaning our schools, our school systems, are not designed in such a way that they could easily make inclusion a priority. Now, what's interesting, the Human Rights Commission came out with their list of barriers. And they said their number one was inconsistent funding. They said 1 year people have things, the next year they don't. How are you supposed to provide a long-term educational program for children when there is no consistent funding? That's an issue. They said physical inaccessibility. Schools are not prepared to deal physically with the physical surroundings, the physical needs of children with special needs. They also said that there was a lack of individualization. A lack of individualization. People wanted to put everybody in one big box and educate them. And as a result, when you start individualizing things and dealing with the students as individuals rather than simply this mass group, then suddenly it makes life more difficult. They also said ineffective dispute resolution mechanisms. That means when an issue comes up, people don't know how to deal with it. They don't understand how to deal with conflict. They forget that the main point is the education of the child as opposed to simply the rules and regulations. While those are important, we must make sure that we are providing the adequate education to our children. The other thing that they said, the Human Rights Commission emphasized, was that the negative attitudes and stereotypes of children with special needs presented a major barrier for any kind of inclusive programs in schools. Now, when you look at the perceptions, and you have recently looked at how students with special needs, those with disabilities, are viewed. Oftentimes they're viewed as pitiful. To simply be patted on the head and let's just try to make it all go away. Oftentimes, people feel uncomfortable in settings where there is an individual with disabilities. Maybe they can't run as fast. Maybe they can't enunciate as clearly. So as a result, people back off and say, can't deal with it. The perceptions that individuals have regarding those that have special needs with disabilities, whether they be physical or mental, present major barriers to any kind of truly inclusive program. In our schools, one of the things that we must look at is what we are doing to ensure that there is an appropriate, effective educational program for every student who walks into our door. If a student is in our school, it is our job as educators, it is our job as administrators to ensure that we provide the adequate educational opportunities for all of those students. Now, does that mean that we can handle every situation? Perhaps not. Why can't we handle those? Because in most cases, we do not have the staffing and the training for our staff to ensure that the program is equitable, that the children are learning. Most teachers only have maybe one course, maybe two, in special education. And in most cases, teachers are asked to make accommodations. During the course of the next several weeks, I want to talk about what we can do in our schools, what we can do in our educational organizations to ensure that we have the physical setting to accommodate students with special needs, making sure that our teachers are adequately trained, that our local communities understand what we are doing and how we are implementing those programs. It is not easy, but teaching in a regular, normal classroom without any special education children at all is also a challenge. It is also difficult at times. Why? Because we're dealing with people. People who bring whatever happens outside of the classroom into the classroom. What happens at home, what happens outside of the classroom walls does have an impact. The role of the teacher has changed dramatically over the last 25, even the last 10 years. Teachers are asked to do more and more. But if you look at the staff development funding, that's gone down. If we want the best education for our children, then we must allocate the resources to train our teachers, to educate our communities about what we are doing, why we are doing it, and asking them to give us feedback on the effectiveness of our programs. We oftentimes throw up barriers and say we can't do it because of money. But I will tell you, in most cases, we can find money to do a lot of other things. To a parent of a child with a special needs, what we are saying is, maybe sports is more important. Maybe this field trip is more important than your child. Just think, if that was your child, what would you want and what would you expect from those in positions of leadership in our schools, both locally and on a national level? I hope my comments today have gotten you to think a little bit differently about what barriers are out there, what resources are needed, and perhaps start looking at how we can overcome those barriers. Start making a plan that will carry forth, not just to appease a few people today, but to ensure that the students in our schools who have special needs have those needs met. It is a challenge to all of us, but one that as educators we gladly welcome, because we joined this profession because we thought we could make a difference in the lives of the children that we encounter every day. When we forget that, we are turning our backs on the sacred mission that we have as educators. I appreciate you listening. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to contact me. Have a great day.